So it's my pleasure to get to talk with Dale Trumbore after getting to know her through her music. The piece of hers that we're going to perform in March is called Charting the World, and it's something we commissioned. We got going on this, I think, at least 2 years ago. Took some time choosing a text, and so it's very exciting that it's getting close to happening. So Dale, I'd like to talk about just a moment about you growing up. You seem to have sung in choirs in high school and college, and I'm interested, what kind of repertoire were you exposed to?
Yeah, in high school, we did a lot of arrangements, I think, as most high schools do, of sort of pop music and Disney tunes, but also a lot of Moses Hogan spiritual arrangements, which I loved.
Yes.
And then in college, I went to the University of Maryland undergrad, and used to joke that Ed McClary, the conductor there, was a big fan, very fond of composers whose last name started with B. So we had Britten and Bach, not so much Beethoven, Brahms, Bruckner.
So was there any particular piece that you fell in love with and that set you off on the course of composing?
Well, I loved Hymn to Saint Cecilia. Just really stole my heart. I hadn't been experienced, or I hadn't experienced that piece before. I hadn't been exposed to very much of Britten's work before college. So I actually, looking back, I could have been a lot more knowledgeable about the classical music rep, just in all genres, in all instrumentations in general, than I was, but I got a really great education just from singing in ensembles and going to as many concerts as I possibly could.
And I know that you started composing yourself at 16, and then things just mushroomed and you got more and more performances and more commissions, and then you had I'm going quickly so that we can talk about other things. And then you had a big moment when you had a CD devoted to your music, and that's the CD that introduced me to your music. That was, well, 3 or 4, 5, 6 years ago for me. And then it went crazy. The big milestone in your career was that recording was listed at number 6 on the Billboard's traditional classical chart. So that's a big moment. I wondered, looking at big moments, do you have any interest in writing an opera ever?
That's a good question. And I want to say I've been composing since I was like 7. I really started composing when I started taking piano lessons, but in terms of those pivotal moments, I think I started entering composition contests when I was about 16, and that was when I got really serious about it. So that was one of those big moments, like you just described. But as far as an opera goes, I think, it's such a huge undertaking. It takes sort of like 3+ years of your life as a composer to really, make sure the libretto is exactly as it should be, and workshop that, and then start writing the music and workshop that, and then to mount the actual production, you need so much, there just needs to be so much money and time thrown behind that project. But I think if someone asked, I certainly wouldn't say no. And I really like the idea of writing maybe a chamber opera. So something that's a little more accessible, accessible, manageable, doesn't require a team of 100 people to put together, maybe just a team of 30 or something, right?
How far in advance do you accept commissions?
Right now, I'm working about 1 to 2, sometimes 3 years out. But yeah, mostly in that. It really depends. Sometimes I'll have a gap in my schedule and just the right commission will come along to fill it. But sometimes things are already filling up for a year from now, or for spring, like May 2024. So I'm pushing things to fall 2024 already. If they don't, unless I can fit it in that little gap of free time.
I want to talk a bit about your writing, because that makes you pretty unusual among successful composers, that you write a lot and very well. Dale wrote a book called Staying Composed, which is sort of about the ups and downs of an artistic life. I guess you could call it a high-class how-to book. and it's been very, very well reviewed. I didn't have a chance to read that, but I read maybe half of the articles, the essays on your site, and they are wonderful, the ones I read, and some of them hilarious. My favorite one for hilarity was called Studying Conducting. And I resonated so much to your saying, why do I write so many meter changes? And that made me think about, oh, yes, in the middle certainly had many meter changes that I had to work on. And then you mentioned losing your place when you were a beginning fledgling conductor. And I have been known to lose my place, not quite in concert, but in dress rehearsal through getting distracted. And those are really interesting things that happen. Then I was also particularly interested in the one called Watching Television at Copeland House, not only because it was so funny and so honest and was about a bad patch in a way of your writing, but because we spend most of our lives now since COVID living right a stone's throw from Copeland House. We have a house between Peekskill and Garrison. So I have driven up on that road, maybe not exactly to the house, but I can see that it would be daunting to be in that house and to have the expectations that go with it. For those who don't know what Copeland House is, it's a house that Copeland lived in, I guess, a lot. And then at his death, he must have given it to the foundation, which now lets it out to artists and I guess all composers, maybe other people, but I think it's an honor to get to go there. How long is the residency?
I think I spent about a month there, and I think you can spend a little longer. There might be options for, I'm not sure if you can do 2 months. But yeah, they have a separate program where they accept a bunch of composers, I think for a week long. I might be wrong on that, but I think it's called Cultivate. And then they have a residency where you apply by yourself, and it's just you as a composer. You're just living in this house where Copeland lived for the last, I think, 2 or so decades of his life. It was the later period of his life, and some furniture belonged to him. Like I think there's couches and that were Copeland's, and it's very intimidating, but it's also just it's sort of magical and intimidating at the same time, right? Very inspiring, and also this sort of pressure that maybe not all composers put on themselves when they're there, but I certainly did, where I was like, oh, I'm living in Copeland's house, and how will I ever measure up to this?
But you worked through this.
I did, yeah. So that's what that essay is about. It's about eventually coming to terms with that and just saying, well, I have to write something while I'm here, and I can only do what I can do. I'm going to do my best and just create what I can right now.
Well, I love your writing saying that it's important for anybody writing music or poetry, I imagine, to write it and then not to self-judge it immediately and throw it out. That's a bad system. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Charting the World and maybe about Diane Thiel. And I think she's a wonderful poet, really terrific. And she's been very well recognized, even though the New Amsterdam Singers and I, who looked at these poems, we didn't know her name, but now we do. So the first poem that we chose was called The First Sea, and it's about childhood and children dreaming, and there are lots of opportunities for subtle word painting. For instance, storm, shadows, swimming, waves, and the string quartet that accompanies it seems to be in constant motion. They may be tired from a lot of playing. They don't get much rest. And they use interesting techniques like glissandos for the word falling, and sul tasto, which gives a special color. And do you have more to elaborate about how you structured that one?
Yeah, I'm really drawn to Diane's work because I think she deals a lot in the stories that we tell ourselves and that we are told, that we grow up hearing, and how we relate our own lives to these, not necessarily fairy tales, but just crafting stories about ourselves. And she also sort of deals in the subconscious thinking about how dreams and memories come into play, how that changes throughout our lives. So this poem is really about, the first line is, the children are sorting the world of dreams and speak of them in the morning, beginning to tell the real from shadow. And I just love, as someone who also thinks about dreaming, like the idea of lucid dreaming has always intrigued me and sort of inspired me in a way. This idea that we could be awake within our dreams, and the idea of what bubbles up from our subconscious. What do we take with us from our memories we almost can grasp, but we can't quite remember. I'm just so, again, like artistically, creatively intrigued, and enticed by Diane's work in that way. And like you said, there's, I think because of the really evocative language she uses, there's so much room for text painting. In a bigger sense, I like to think of text painting not just, melodically or even rhythmically, but the overall, like sort of ambient chords. What's the harmonic underpinnings of this piece? I think all of that can be informed by the text, and this text is just full of those wonderful opportunities for a composer.
And then there's Counting Two, which we all fell in love with as a poem first, and now you've done a fantastic job with that. And talk about harmonies. The word one is very important. The word two is very important. One gets its very own note, F, and two gets its very own chord, A flat major. And these are recurring. And I think that an audience will hear them as important and different. And then there's some more obvious things, like a flute plays some reference to bird song. There's a wonderful pizzicato passage in the strings where you've given them jazzy syncopation for the words, a march of ants. That's something that a very young child is counting, a march of ants. And also a train whistle, when it manages, somehow the strings manage to sound like woo woo for a train, and I'm not sure how that happened, because if somebody asked me to sing a train whistle, I couldn't do it. But you said it that way. So this has been fun, not super, super hard, but really a fun project. And I'm so glad you're going to come to the first concert. That's really great. So I also wanted to mention something about writing for avocational versus professional choruses, because a lot of what you did on that wonderful recording was for professional chorus. And when I listened to that, I said, oh, this is gorgeous. We could never do it because it's too heavy. It's not for us, it's for prose. So you've now sort of asked yourself to also write for avocational groups, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think of assessing the difficulty, like the maximum difficulty level that a choir can perform at, as, okay, maybe that bar is here, it's a certain amount of difficulty. And then my job as the composer is not to bump right up against that line. It's to maybe figure out, okay, we're going to write this piece a little less challenging than the choir's, utmost. We're pouring all of our resources and all of our rehearsal time into this piece, because the reality is I'm not, unless I'm writing a concert length piece, I'm not the only piece on the program, right? You will have other pieces you need to rehearse. And so if I'm writing you the most challenging, right, it's really thorny and the rhythms are really hard, all of that, it's going to be really hard to put together in the rehearsal time you have. And for a premiere, I think everyone involved, everyone invested in this project wants to see it succeed, right? The composer wants a successful first performance. So do the singers in the ensemble. So does the conductor. So it is I think it's actually a sort of a fun challenge to assess that, like, where can I push? I like to use the term, I call it choosing your challenge for any given piece. Is it going to be rhythmically challenging? Is it going to be harmonically challenging, melodically challenging? And then maybe there are other aspects that also, there are moments of complexity, but really, if we ease up on some other elements of the music, it makes it easier to focus in that precious rehearsal time on the truly challenging elements.
Well, the poem that you wrote called For the Daughter I May Never Have, how did that come about, that you wrote the poem?
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking a lot about as someone I'm 35 as of November of last year, and it's an age where I know, at least for me, as someone who could potentially have children, I just was thinking a lot about do I want kids? Do I not want kids? I'm watching many of my peers make that decision as well, by virtue of being around this age. So I was approached about I forget what gosh, it must have been two or three years ago maybe, about writing a piece for lower voiced choir, right, mostly men's voices, and the conductor wanted a piece that reflected my experience, identifying as a woman, what's something that I'm sort of mulling over or grappling with as part of my identity that I might write for this group. And so I think opening it up as this more universal question of imagining a future child that you may or may not have, and writing a letter to them, sort of a love letter to them, knowing that they might not exist. I just, again, was intrigued by
It's
both.
fascinating.
Yeah, the art.
Wonderful idea. I haven't looked at the music yet, but it's just fascinating. And now I see you have it in a version for men and a version for women.
Yeah. I actually enjoyed the experience of writing that poem so much. I double majored in undergrad. I have an English degree with a focus in creative writing for poetry, but I sort of neglected that for a long time. Then I came back to it. But for this particular poem, I enjoyed writing it so much. I ended up writing like a chapbook length series of poems about making the decision, ultimately probably not to have children, but just really, I just think there's so much to mine there about how that decision is made.
Such
and
a
so
personal topic to put out there to the world in a poem and a piece. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, I like the idea though of music as memoir. The idea that memoir, right? Not memoir isn't just sort of writing a diary entry and being like, here's what I did today, or here's what my life is, right? It's making sense in retrospect of a life experience of your own in a way that hopefully either appeals to other people or has something that other people can recognize in themselves. And so I like the idea of music doing that as well as writing. Say one thing I really love about this piece, aside from the poetry, is the chance to write for chamber ensemble and chorus. That's something I've been trying to do more and more of lately, because I've written so much for a cappella choir or chorus and piano. I'm a pianist, so I love writing for piano, but at the same time, getting to write for chorus, which is really like my favorite. I don't know if I should say it's my favorite medium or instrumentation to write it, but it probably is, right? That's at least 80% of what I do as a composer is music for chorus, but also getting to tie in like an orchestra or a chamber orchestra or a chamber ensemble. It's so fulfilling as a chorus or as a composer to write for not just chorus.
One of your essays is entitled, "Don't Expect Congrats." And I didn't know what to expect, but I thought I'd read it. And then you got going on lady composer. And that I had to tell you what I'm writing in program notes on the very subject of lady composer. I'm going to read you the beginning of this program's program note. I'm writing, as we spent time with the music and the poetry, I saw that there were some pleasing connections. For example, I was quite astonished to find that 6 of the 7 texts we sing include the word dream. And here's another connection, that almost every composer is a woman. This, like the dream links, is the result of a happy coincidence, not an agenda, however worthy. Now, that was my way of trying to have it both ways, to show everybody we're doing a lot of works by women without having people say that they were chosen only because they were women, which is not the case at all. They were chosen because I liked their music. So
yeah, I love that. I love that. that way to have it both ways, right? I think yeah, it's great to seek out works by historically underrepresented composers, but it doesn't have to be a big deal, right? And it doesn't have to be something tokenizing,
Right.
which is everything I say in that article. I know I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak here, but I think some
tell people what's in your article, because it's what you write was just so perfect, and I agreed with every word of it. But go ahead, explain more.
Yeah, I mean, I want my music to be programmed and programmed because people love it. Like that's the goal, right? Not because someone's trying to check boxes, but also at the same time, I think if we rely only, I think this is changing very quickly, but for so long, the rep that was programmed again and again, especially in university settings, was very, very male, very white, very dead, very just homogenous, right? And so sometimes it takes conscious effort on the part of people in positions of programming power to go and look beyond what they've been taught their whole lives. I think it's sort of lazy to just rely on the music that you've done, 100 times already, or 20 times, 5 times, because you were taught it and so you're doing it. No, like go out, seek out new composers, seek out new voices, and find the people you really love and be a champion on their behalf. I think that kind of relationship between composer and conductor is so important, and that's been a huge influence on my life and my career. And I would just encourage I don't know if any other conductors will be watching this, but I would encourage everyone, every conductor I know, to just go and try to find voices you haven't heard before or you're not as familiar with.